Every king and queen in Europe is descended from the same person. Not metaphorically, literally. Trace any royal bloodline. The Windsors in England, the Bourbons in Spain, the descendants of the Romanovs in Russia. Trace them through the marriages, the cousins, the great-great-grandparents. Every line, without exception, hits a wall around the year 1700. And on the other side of that wall, the same handful of ancestors. The same bloodline, the same suspicious gap in the records where everything before that point gets blurry, contested, and eventually erased. This isn't a conspiracy. The genealogists confirm it. The DNA confirms it. They just don't talk about what it actually means. This is the story of where the blue blood really came from. Before we go any further, if this channel asks the questions you've never heard asked before, hit subscribe. There's a video on screen right now that traces another lineage they don't want you looking at. Watch it after this one. Now let's open the door they've kept shut for 300 years. For most of your life, you've been told that European royal families are different from each other. The British monarchy is its own thing. The Spanish royals are Spanish, the Russian Tsars were Russian, the German Kaisers were German. The truth is something every serious genealogist has known for over 200 years. There is no such thing as a British royal family, or a Spanish one, or any of them. There is one royal family that has been intermarrying with itself for so long that calling them by country names is a marketing trick. It tells you who they govern. It does not tell you who they are. Queen Victoria, who ruled the British Empire at its peak, had grandchildren on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Romania, Greece, Spain, Norway, and Sweden. Her family, literally, was the royal family of most of Europe at the same time. They called her the grandmother of Europe, and they meant it medically. When the First World War started in 1914, the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia were first cousins. They had played together as children, and then their armies killed 9 million people. That part of the story you've probably heard. What you haven't been told is that this wasn't unusual. This is exactly how European royalty has worked for at least the last 1,000 years. The Habsburgs in Austria married Habsburgs in Spain. The Bourbons married Bourbons. When new families took thrones, they immediately married into the old families. The pool was always tiny on purpose. And by the time you trace it back 6 or 7 generations, the lines start crossing each other again and again. The same names keep showing up. The same lineages keep merging. Genealogists have a word for this. They call it pedigree collapse. The further back you go, the smaller the family tree gets, not larger. Eventually, you reach a point where almost everyone with European royal blood traces back to the same person, the same century, and the same suspicious gap in the historical record. That person, officially, is a man named Charlemagne, born around 748, crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, King of the Franks, conqueror of half of Europe, the founder of what we now call European civilization. Every reigning monarch in Europe today claims descent from Charlemagne. Every dethroned royal family claims it too. Every noble house with paperwork going back far enough lands at his feet. Mathematically, this should not be surprising. If you do the math on how many ancestors you have, 1,000 years back you have more theoretical ancestors than there were humans alive at the time. The lines have to collapse. Charlemagne, having had a large family with documented descendants, becomes the great funnel that everyone in Europe with any aristocratic blood eventually passes through. That is the official explanation. It is almost satisfying. Until you ask the question that the official story never wants you to ask. Where did Charlemagne come from? Where did his blood come from? Because Charlemagne wasn't the start of anything. He was the result of something. His father was Pepin the Short. His grandfather was Charles Martel. His great-grandfather was someone called Pepin of Herstal. And before that, the records get thin. Then they get contradictory. Then they vanish. The man who is supposed to be the source of all European royal blood has himself a foggy origin. His own family tree, going backward, dissolves into mist about 3 generations before him, just far enough back that nobody can verify it. And that's only the first wall. There are more. Before Charlemagne's family ruled the Franks, another family did. They were called the Merovingians, and the Merovingians did not bother pretending they were ordinary humans. The Merovingians ruled the Franks for nearly 300 years, from the late 400s until they were quietly removed from power in 751. The man who removed them was Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short. Pepin had been the mayor of the palace, basically the prime minister, and he wanted the actual crown. So he wrote to the Pope and asked permission to remove the Merovingian king. The Pope said yes. Pepin shaved the last Merovingian king's head and shipped him off to a monastery. That's how the Merovingian line officially ended, quietly, by haircut. Now, why would shaving someone's head be a powerful act? Because the Merovingian kings were known as the long-haired kings. They never cut their hair. Their hair was considered the physical seat of their royal power. Cutting a Merovingian's hair was supposed to drain their authority and their bloodline magic. They believed this. The Franks believed this. The Pope, apparently, believed this enough to authorize it. And here's where it gets stranger. The Merovingians did not claim to descend from a normal human ancestor. They claimed their bloodline came from a sea creature. The founding myth of their dynasty, written down in the 7th century by the chronicler Fredegar, is this. The mother of Merovech, the founding king of the line, was bathing in the sea when she was approached by a creature described as a kinotaur, a kind of 5-horned sea beast. She conceived a child. That child was Merovech. From Merovech came the entire Merovingian bloodline. Historians today dismiss this as obvious myth, a founder legend like Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf. Symbolic, not literal. But the Merovingians themselves treated it as literal. They believed their blood was not entirely human, and they were obsessed with proving it. Merovingian kings were documented as unusually tall. They had unusually fair skin and unusual longevity for the period. They were said to be able to heal disease by touch, a power that was later inherited by the French and English royal lines, who continued the practice of royal touching to cure sick subjects all the way into the 1700s. The Merovingians did not believe they ruled because they were elected. They did not believe they ruled because they were strong. They believed they ruled because their blood was different, and they trained their kingdom to believe it too. Now you might say, fine, this was their propaganda. Every dynasty invents its own mythology. Big claims are how new families lock down power. But here is the part that does not fit. Every royal house that came after the Merovingians inherited their genealogy. Pepin the Short, who shaved the last Merovingian king, immediately married his son Charlemagne into a Merovingian noble family. The new dynasty did not erase the old bloodline. It absorbed it. By the time Charlemagne was crowned, the Carolingian line had Merovingian blood running through it from multiple directions, and every royal house in Europe descended from Charlemagne, therefore also descended from the Merovingians, including the British, including the Spanish, including the Russians. So the question becomes, if the Merovingians were just any old Frankish family who invented a flattering myth, why did every conquering dynasty that came after them treat their blood as essential? Why did every line that took a throne in Europe immediately marry into the family they replaced? Because the throne was never the point. The blood was the point. The crown was just a hat. The blood was the actual permission to wear it, and the blood had to come from somewhere. The Merovingians said it came from the sea. Modern historians say that's a metaphor, but for a metaphor it is a remarkably specific one, a bloodline from across the water, a foreign origin, an ancestor that came from somewhere else and walked out of the waves onto European soil. That is not how European peasants described their kings. That is how a people describes their conquerors. Now we need to talk about a period of European history that does not really exist. Open a textbook to the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, traditionally dated to the year 476, then flip forward to the rise of Charlemagne in the late 700s. You are looking at roughly 300 years that historians have called, depending on who you ask, the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages, or, more carefully these days, the Migration period. What happened in those 300 years? You will get an answer. You will be told that various tribes moved around. Visigoths went to Spain. Ostrogoths went to Italy. Franks consolidated in Gaul. There were small kingdoms. There was war. There was plague. There was decline. And then the answer trails off, because the actual surviving records from that period are extraordinarily thin. Cities that the Romans had built and documented in detail with populations in the hundreds of thousands simply disappear from the historical record for centuries. Then they reappear, often with completely different names, completely different layouts, and a story that does not quite explain what happened to them in between. Rome itself, which had over 1 million inhabitants in the 2nd century, is said to have collapsed to under 30,000 people by the year 600. Where did the rest go? The official answer is that they died, fled, or scattered. But there are no mass graves consistent with that scale of die-off. The same thing happened across Europe. Constantinople, which kept records, continues, but the western cities go silent. Britain, which had been a Roman province with stone roads and Latin literacy, somehow forgets how to build in stone within 2 generations. 3 centuries pass, and then, like a curtain rising, the Carolingians appear. Charlemagne's empire, built between 768 and 814, somehow reconstructs Roman-style governance, architecture, legal codes, and coronation ceremonies, all within a single generation. The Pope crowns him in Rome. He is called Emperor of the Romans. He sponsors a project to recover and copy classical texts. How did all of this knowledge survive the 300 years of darkness? The official answer is, in monasteries. Some texts were preserved by monks, some traditions survived underground, but the scale of the reconstruction does not match the scale of the supposed preservation. Charlemagne's court did not just remember a few books, it rebuilt an imperial civilization, with administrators, engineers, and diplomats who knew protocol, with genealogists who could trace conveniently his lineage back through the supposed dark centuries to ancestors that nobody else has any documentation for. If you wanted to insert a bloodline into history, this is exactly where you would do it, a period nobody can verify. A gap where records do not survive, a convenient 3 centuries where any family could claim to have been preserving knowledge and noble blood in some remote monastery or hidden court. The Merovingians claimed exactly that. They claimed descent from before the Roman collapse through bloodlines preserved during the chaos. The Carolingians claimed the same thing. And then every dynasty that came after, all the way up to the Windsors, claimed it too. But the original document, the single piece of paper that proves the connection across that 300-year gap, the actual evidence, it does not exist. It has never existed. It is taken on faith. And that faith, conveniently, only had to be solidified once, around the year 1700. That is the next wall. If you actually try to research royal genealogy, here is what you find. For any noble house in Europe, the documentary records get firmer the closer you get to the present day. After 1850, the paperwork is exhaustive. Between 1700 and 1850, it is detailed. Before 1700, it gets patchy. Before 1500, much of it is reconstructed from later sources. And before 1200, large portions of it are reconstructed from sources written hundreds of years after the events they describe. This is normal. Paper does not last forever. Records get lost, fires happen, wars destroy archives. Nobody disputes that the further you go back, the less you can verify. But there is something strange about the specific period right around 1700. Almost every major European royal house, at some point between 1680 and 1750, commissioned a comprehensive new official genealogy of itself. These were not minor projects. They were enormous undertakings. They involved historians, heralds, monks, and royal genealogists working for years. They produced volumes that became the foundation of how those houses' lineages are taught today. The Bourbons did it. The Habsburgs did it. The Stuarts and the Hanoverians did it. The Brandenburg Hohenzollerns in Prussia did it. The Wittelsbachs in Bavaria did it. The Romanovs did it later, but used French and German sources from this period as their template. All of them in the same period, deciding at roughly the same time to write down once and for all who they were descended from. Why then? The official explanation is that this was the age of absolute monarchy. Kings like Louis XIV had consolidated power and were performing their legitimacy on a public stage. The genealogies were part of the show. Everyone was doing it because everyone else was doing it. That is a fine explanation. It is also a remarkably efficient one, because the practical effect of every royal house writing down its lineage at the same time, drawing on the same scribes, working in the same intellectual networks with the same political incentives, is that they all wrote down stories that agreed with each other. The Bourbon genealogy in France did not contradict the Habsburg genealogy in Spain, because both families were intermarried and both genealogies were being produced by scholars who corresponded with each other. The Romanovs, when they later updated their records, used these continental templates because their own pre-Romanov records were even thinner than everybody else's, and the source documents that all of these reconstructions relied on. The supposed medieval manuscripts, the supposed monastery records, the supposed ancient chronicles, most of them were copies of copies of copies made by the same handful of monastic networks over the centuries. The oldest surviving copies, in most cases, date from after the year 1100, describing events from before the year 800. We are being asked to believe a paper trail that, at its most critical points, has been reconstructed by interested parties working at the moment of maximum political need to have a clean lineage. This is not an argument that those families are fake. They are obviously real. They obviously exist. They obviously have descendants. The DNA confirms they are all related to each other. This is an argument that we do not actually know where they came from. The records say one thing. The records were written or rewritten around 1700. And nobody can show you the original source. So if the records cannot tell us, we have to look at the map. There is a particular kind of map that no school in the West shows you anymore. If you go to a museum that displays cartography from the 1600s and 1700s, or you find digital archives of those maps online, you will see something strange. Across nearly every map of the world drawn in Europe between roughly 1570 and 1780, a single enormous empire dominates the eastern half of the continent. It is labelled on French maps Grande Tartarie, on English maps Great Tartary, on Dutch maps Groot Tartarie. It stretches from the Volga River in the west, all the way across Central Asia, into Mongolia, into northern China, and up to the Pacific coast. It dwarfs every European nation. It is, on these maps, the largest political entity on Earth. By the year 1800, it is gone. The territory has been redrawn. Russia covers the western part, China covers the southern part, Mongolia is a small remnant in the middle. The name Tartaria has been quietly retired. The empire it described has been quietly forgotten. This is the part where mainstream historians and the alternative history community disagree most sharply. The mainstream position is that Tartaria was never really one empire. It was a geographic term. Europeans used it loosely to describe everything they did not know much about east of the Volga. When European cartographers got better information in the 1700s, they replaced the vague name Tartary with more accurate political labels. That is a plausible explanation. Here is what does not fit. European travellers in the 1600s wrote about Tartaria as if it had a capital. They named it. Some called it Cambalu, others Cambalik, others gave it different names depending on the dynasty they were describing. They wrote about its court, they described its emperor, they mentioned trade routes, ambassadors, royal protocols, and a state apparatus that was clearly more than a loose collection of nomadic tribes. The Dutch ambassador, Nicholas Witsen, writing in the late 1600s, described Tartaria as a structured empire with internal administration and external diplomatic relations. He was working for the Dutch East India Company. They had financial reasons to know exactly what they were dealing with. In 1771, a French encyclopedia called Tartaria, a sovereign state of immense extent. Less than 30 years later, the same encyclopedia had quietly removed all such claims. The official answer is the expansion of the Russian Empire, the rise of the Qing dynasty in China, and improved European knowledge of Central Asian geography. The combination of those forces, we are told, broke up the loose region called Tartary into the more specific political units we recognize today. But this answer has a strange feature. If Tartaria was just a vague geographic label, why does its replacement happen so cleanly? Why does the name disappear simultaneously from English, French, Dutch, German and Italian sources within the span of a few decades? Why are pre-1700 documents that reference Tartarian rulers, Tartarian ambassadors, and Tartarian trade goods treated by later historians as either confused, mistaken, or fabricated? Look at the architecture. This is where the Tartaria community has done its most interesting work. Across Central Asia, into Siberia, into the Caucasus, and surprisingly far west into European Russia and the Balkans, there are buildings that share an extraordinarily consistent style. Domes, star-shaped citadels, ornate stonework that does not match the surrounding local traditions. Whole cities, in some cases, that look like they were designed by a single coherent civilization. Mainstream historians attribute these to a mix of influences, some Persian, some Mongol, some Russian, some Ottoman, a patchwork created by trade and conquest over centuries. But the patchwork is suspiciously coherent. The proportions are similar. The decorative motifs are similar. The construction techniques are similar. When you compare these structures across thousands of miles, what you see is not separate cultures borrowing from each other. You see one culture with one architectural program spread across a single enormous territory. That is what an empire's architecture looks like, not a trading network. Now, here is the connection back to the bloodline. In several pre-1700 European sources, the rulers of Tartaria are described as descending from a single ancient royal line. Some sources call them the descendants of the Great Khan, but other sources, particularly diplomatic correspondence from the 1500s and 1600s, describe the Tartarian imperial family as something older, pre-Mongol, a line that claimed descent from kings who had ruled the steppe and beyond since before recorded history. The same claim, almost exactly, that the Merovingians made. The same claim, almost exactly, that every European royal house traces itself back to. A bloodline of unknown origin, a pre-recorded ancient royalty, a family whose right to rule did not come from any particular place, but from the blood itself. By 1800, that family was gone from the Eastern Empire. The empire was gone too. The name had been wiped, the architecture had been reattributed. But around the same time, in Europe, a small set of royal families was suddenly consolidating power on a scale not seen since Rome. They were intermarrying with each other so densely that within 3 generations they were all the same family. They were commissioning genealogies that traced their blood back through gaps in the historical record to ancient origins that nobody could verify, and the records that would have explained where they came from, the Tartarian records, the Eastern records, the documents from before 1700. Most of them were destroyed in the fires of the 1700s, in the wars, in the libraries that burned, in the archives that were lost during transitions of power. What survived was the European story. What was erased was where the European story came from. So let's put this together. The European royal houses, all of them, share common ancestors before the year 1700. Genealogists confirm it, DNA confirms it, the math of pedigree collapse demands it. Those common ancestors lead back eventually to Charlemagne, and through Charlemagne to the Merovingian line. The Merovingian line itself claimed an origin outside of recorded human history. They said their blood came from across the water, from outside, from elsewhere. The period between the fall of Rome and the rise of Charlemagne, 300 years, is missing most of its records. The original documents that prove the lineages across that gap do not exist. The lineages were reconstructed in their modern form around the year 1700 simultaneously by multiple royal houses working with shared scholarly networks. At the exact same time these reconstructions were happening, an enormous Eastern Empire on every European map for the previous 2 centuries was being quietly erased from the cartographic record. Its rulers, who had claimed an ancient bloodline of their own, vanish from the diplomatic correspondence. The territory is redistributed. The name is retired. You can read all of that as coincidence, or you can ask the question that the alternative history community has been asking for the last 20 years. What if the bloodline came from the East? What if the original royal families of Europe, the families that exist today, are not native European nobility at all? What if they are the surviving heirs of the empire we now call Tartaria, who relocated west during or after the collapse of that empire, and who installed themselves over local European populations as kings claiming an ancient lineage? The pieces that don't make sense in the official story start to make sense in this one. You get an explanation for why every royal house traces back to the same handful of ancestors. They are all branches of the same family that arrived in Europe. You get an explanation for the missing records before 1700. The records of where they actually came from were Eastern records, and those records were destroyed or hidden as part of the process of legitimizing the new Western dynasties. You get an explanation for why the European powers spent the 1700s and 1800s aggressively expanding eastward into Central Asia, displacing whatever remained of the Tartarian world, not as colonial expansion but as a closing of the loop, erasing the homeland of the bloodline that was now ruling Europe. And you get an explanation for the architectural consistency from Bukhara to St. Petersburg to Berlin. The royal architecture of pre-modern Europe, particularly the architecture of the 1700s, looks the way it does because it is descended from the imperial architecture of the same family that had ruled the Eastern Empire. I'm not telling you any of this is proven. I'm telling you that the official story has more holes in it than the alternative story does. And the holes are not random. They are concentrated at exactly the points where it would matter most for somebody to hide where they came from. The single most important thing a ruling family can ever do is control its own origin story. If you can decide what people are told about where you came from, you can decide why you have the right to be in charge. For 300 years now, in Europe, that origin story has been a particular version of medieval history that conveniently funnels all royal blood through a handful of unverifiable medieval figures, conveniently obscures everything that happened east of the Urals before 1700, and conveniently makes it impossible to investigate the alternative without sounding like a crank. Maybe it is the truth. Maybe Charlemagne really was the source. Maybe the Merovingian myths were always fiction. Maybe Tartaria really was just a vague label for nothing in particular, or maybe the blue blood was never European at all. Maybe it came from the empire they erased. Maybe the kings of Europe were always foreigners pretending to be natives, and maybe the reason they have spent the last 3 centuries fighting each other in world wars while staying related to each other is because the rivalry was always internal. A family argument dressed up as international politics conducted by the descendants of an empire that none of us are supposed to remember existed. Here is what survives when the dust settles on all of this. Royal genealogies in their current form are political documents. They were assembled in their modern shape during the period of European absolutism by interested parties, using sources that were themselves selected, copied, and curated by earlier interested parties. They are stories about lineage, written by the people who benefited most from those stories being believed. The fact that they all agree on a common ancestor before 1700 is, by itself, not strange. The strange thing is the gap. The strange thing is the synchronized erasure of an entire Eastern Empire at exactly the moment when the Western royal houses are securing their official narrative. Whatever you believe happened, one thing is hard to argue with. The people sitting on the thrones of Europe today and the people who sat on those thrones for the last several centuries are not descended from the populations they ruled. They are descended from each other. They are a closed bloodline that has been a closed bloodline for as long as anyone can verify. The genealogical math demands it. The DNA confirms it. A closed bloodline always comes from somewhere. It is never accidental. It exists when a family makes a deliberate, sustained, multi-generational decision that their genes are different from everybody else's and must not be diluted. The question is not whether this bloodline existed. It obviously did. It still exists. Some of them are in the news every week. The question is where it came from before the wall at 1700, before the Carolingian reconstruction, before the Merovingian sea creature, before whatever happened in the gap between Rome and the medieval West. The official answer is that we cannot fully know because the records are lost. The alternative answer is that the records are not lost. They were destroyed. And they were destroyed because they pointed east to an empire we have been told never really existed in the way it claimed to exist, and to a bloodline that did not start in Europe at all. You will have to decide for yourself which answer is closer to the truth. The evidence in either direction is partial. The deeper you look, the more the certainties fall away, which is, in a strange way, the most honest thing you can say about any of this. But if you walk away from this with one question to keep with you, let it be this one. When a family destroys the records of its own origin, what is it hiding? If you want to see what happened to the architecture that empire left behind, there is a video on screen right now that walks through buildings that should not exist. Watch it next, and keep asking the questions they don't want asked.